We all know that Kavita Panjabi is an ex-professor of comparative literature. Comparative literature is her field, but women's studies has been a lifelong preoccupation, and she has been very immersed in that. Her scholarship has spanned both comparative literature as well as women's issues and women's studies. Urvashi Butalia, and a very warm welcome, Urvashi, first time in this festival and in Shanti-Niketan, as is Kavita Panjabi's. Urvashi is joining us from Delhi, Kavita from Kolkata. Urvashi is a publisher and a writer, co-founder of the path-breaking Kali for women. And I still remember the excitement with which we discovered this feminist printing press when all we had internationally was Virago and women's press. Yeah. And to find that India had also begun its very own women's publishing house was a source of great excitement for all of us. So Kali for Women was begun by Urvashi, and she is now director of Zubaan, also a feminist publishing house, and the author of the award-winning oral history of partition, The Other Side of Silence, Voices from the Partition of India. In her long career, Urvashi has played many roles. She's been an educator, she's been a sort of a policy maker, she's participated in on-ground field studies. And so everything that she has to say about the women's movement and her perspective on it is really to be treasured and valued. The third person who is going to be joining us today from Kolkata is Asha Singh. Asha is an assistant professor in gender studies with the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Kolkata. She has also taught at Ambedkar University, Delhi, Amity University, Noida, Adamas University, Kolkata, and the Mahatma Gandhi Antarashtriya Hindi Vishwavidyalaya in Wardha, the Kolkata Center. She's also been a journalist in Hindi newspapers, and she has a PhD from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. She focuses her work on the intersections of gender, caste, and migration in Bhojpuri folk songs, particularly looking at women's role and women's contribution. She has also written on the OBC women's question. So I very warmly welcome all the panelists, and I'd like to start by asking Urvashi to come in on this question of how you see the entire gamut of women and India from independence to now. What would you pick out as your talking points, let's say?
So I was just grumbling that technology is made to defeat you. It's particularly made to defeat women, because while this mic is holdable, so like Kavita, I also teach. And when I'm teaching my class, I have to wear something called a lapel mic. I don't have a lapel. And then that mic, yeah, really, it's meant for men, no? And then that mic assumes that you will be wearing clothes with a pocket into which you can put that unit that needs to be carried. And I don't have a pocket in most of my kurtas. So what I have to do is turn around in front of my students and very inelegantly in front of 100 students, lift up my kurta. And while the technician can tuck that unit into my churidar. I mean, how elegant is that? So talking about women in India, I think that's a good start. So, but Anjum, thanks for the question. You know, my feeling is this isn't a question we should be asking. Why? Because we don't ask what's happened with men in India in 75 years. That question is posed as what's happened in 75 years of India's history. And it is assumed that the people we are talking about are men. Whereas we ask that question separately of women. So I do want to say that we should be asking that question differently, because it's men and women in the making of India and in the last 75 years, men and women and others. Having said that, there is a lot, and one can't sort of map it in 5 minutes. But I think, to me, the most important thing is what has happened with women and what hasn't happened with men. Okay. Because women have made great strides. No thanks to the state. They've done a lot of things on their own, and I'll talk about a few of those. But our men are still stuck in the 19th century, when those social reformers were trying to prove themselves to the British and were taking up things like child marriage, widow remarriage, etc. Our modern day men, what are they doing? They are looking at triple talaq, they're looking at the hijab, they're looking at the age of consent, And they are basically saying, we know what's good for the women, and we are passing laws to make lives better for you. But basically what they're doing is to pass laws to push women back into the home and to settle them into the patriarchal mold that has not gone away from their minds, that has only become stronger, and that has become stronger because of the totally casteist, totally fundamentalist, totally, I don't know, all of those things, you know what I'm talking about, which have solidified the misogyny and patriarchy that is endemic in our society. That, having said that, I want to go back to what women have done, what women's movements have done. And right from the moment of independence or pre-independence, where we see the dream of the new India being dreamed or dreamt of by men and women and shared, and women coming, setting up institutions, thinking of the kind of human beings that we want in the new free India, buying into nationalism, and other women at the ground level saying, this is not what we want. We want better share of the produce, as in the Telangana armed movement, as in Tebhaga, which Kavita will talk about. So you get women at many levels, one, subscribing to the dream of the nation, and two, actually fighting against it and saying, that's not the nation we want to talk about, we want a different nation. And bringing into that, as you proceed into the 70s, a whole range of things, including, for example, in the anti-price rise movement, which is a totally women-led movement in Maharashtra in the mid-70s, where women are fighting hoarding high prices, or the Shahada peasant movement in Maharashtra, where women are fighting sexual violence and fighting landowning farmers at a peasant level, or in the Bodh Gaya movement in roughly the 70s, which is happening in Bihar, where women are fighting for land rights and saying to progressive men who are fighting with them to grab land from zamindars, etc., that once, since we have been part of the battle of fighting, when you get the land, why are the land deeds only in the name of men? Why don't we get it? So they fought and succeeded. And to Chipko, where women are fighting to protect the environment, to the setting up of organizations like Seva. So you get this throughout. To, if you go further back into the history, the Mahad Satyagraha, where Dalits come with Ambedkar after a conference to draw water from a pond, and where the background work of that thing has been done by women who have each given up a handful of rice and grain for the conference. So they've provided the background work. Innumerable instances of ground level and elite women, people coming in. You look at the history of legislation. There has been some excellent legislation, some terrible legislation, and some halfway through, all fought for by women. Give me an example of one, barring 377, piece of legislation which has been fought for only by men and which they have succeeded in. And yet I can give you 10 that have been fought for by women, right? So I think there is also that. Having said that, I think there is still a long way to go. We are still not seen as citizens of this country in our own right, as the recent Citizenship Amendment Act and the ways in which women who were protesting their citizenship rights were treated and told that you don't know what you're doing, somebody's put you up to it. The ways in which a 24-year-old doctor from Kerala who converted to Islam and then married a Muslim, her marriage was annulled by the court because the court said, no, you don't know what you're doing, your father knows. So we still have to fight all this. The ways in which education is being denied to young girls who want to wear the hijab. I may not agree with the hijab, I don't, but that's their thing. What they're fighting for is an education and to wear the clothes they want. Whereas you don't stop guys with vibhuti on their foreheads coming to study. That's not seen as. So we have huge battles to fight. But I think that if you look at change, change is never linear. It's always 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And I think women have been at the forefront of it in this country. But nobody's written that history other than us feminists, including big historians like Ram Guha and others who just don't see women in our history.
Thank you, Urvashi. You made some very cogent points. First of all, by pointing out that just to have a session where we're looking at women and how women have fared over the years of independence is very telling, because if it really was the way it should be, which is that you don't need to make a separate story for the women, then we wouldn't need a session like this. But the point is that it hasn't been the same movement forward. And at the same time, to point out how much women have done, which goes unrecognized, unsung, unseen very often, where they have been working away at change and making that change happen very often for themselves and everybody around them. So thanks for that. Kavita, you have put in a lot of work and research around women's movements, particularly movements where women have taken to activism and militancy when needed to achieve their goals. Would you like to talk? Which perspective would you like to pick up?
So I'm very fortunate that Urvashi went before me and she tackled India, which is like really difficult for me to do. But Anjum, to answer your question, I think what I'll do is I'll tackle the borders. So no, are there two aspects? There's many. I mean, the women's movement been a very, very exciting place and movement to be in across the last, I don't know, since the 80s, late 80s when I've been with it. But I think the two aspects of it that I'll talk about today are two aspects very, very dear to me. One is about our unclaimed history across borders in Bengal, the Tebhaga movement, the Tebhaga women's movement. And the other is unspoken histories that have taken place in the last maybe 20 years ago, 25 years ago, where people like Urvashi have been participant in those histories. So we'll be talking about her history also, actually, what she's been doing amongst other people. So, but both cross-border, one this side and one that side on the other Indo-Pak side. And 147 and 171. 47 meaning 46, actually. So, I remember once I was coming back from the Jaipur Women's Movement Conference in the late 80s. And in the train on the way back, and we've been talking a lot about women in political participation. And on the way back, the conversation continued with Joshua Reddy. And the book, Telangana book, we were making history. The book of Telangana women's movement had just come out a few years ago. And I had heard that there'd been huge numbers of women in the Tebhaga movement in Bengal in the 40s. And I was really, really keen to research this. And when we were talking about it, Joshua Reddy was also there in the train with us. And we were saying, there's no way but to go and meet these women who were by then in their 60s and 70s. So she was very encouraging. I was really laid back and she was the one who was saying, go do it. So I set out, and it started with going to someone's house in Kolkata and then going across the border to Bangladesh and then going right across the 11 districts of Tebhaga that I researched. But so Tebhaga was, Tebhaga got a two-line mention in our history books. It was a peasant movement against zamindars by landless sharecroppers. And they were completely severely exploited. I'm not going into the details of that exploitation, but it was a movement of sharecroppers against landlords for a greater share of the crop. They had to give up 2/3 of the share. It was like, we'll give you 1/3 share of the crop. And this was after the Bengal famine. The Bengal famine took place in 43. The movement finally materialized in 46. There's a direct connection. What was absolutely amazing was the Mahila Atmarokha Samiti, which had been started as a movement for self-defense, Women's Self-Defense League, translated into the Mahila Atmarokha Samiti. 1942, it had 500 members. 1943, the year of the Bengal famine, it had 43,500 members. Overnight, 43,000 women more joined. Why? It's langar khanas, the food for the starving peasants who are entering Calcutta. It's reaching out in terms of providing sustenance, providing support. The world wars have already been happening. There's been devastation there by the soldiers, but it was the famine that was a mobilizing factor. What's been amazing, I'm just jumping ahead, there's too little time to talk now, but one of the reasons that pushed me into this was because I've got sick of hearing that feminism is an armchair movement in India. Feminism is a Western import in India. Growing up in India, there's a whole underlying sea of strength that you experience from the women in your families, in your workplaces, amongst your friends, and it's not a Western import. There's something that's organic there. And I wanted to discover what it was in our own histories that could actually sustain us. What do I discover? The Tebhaga women's movement was the first bridging of peasant women and city women. And peasant women, the city women met the peasant women who'd come to the cities in search of food. And then city women also went out to the areas to live with the peasant women and work with them. And it was the first demands for women's rights as workers came in the 40s from the Tebhaga movement in Dinajpur. They would storm Mohila Turukha Shamiti centers where they did not have centers. They would go to centers in the next town and say, "Amader ekhane khola hoyni keno? Amrao Swadeshi, Amrao Kormi, Amra kaj kori." So they're claiming their identity as workers. They're the first that we know of who begin to make demands against the exploitation, stop the sexual exploitation of women by the zamindars collectively. When a peasant got married, the right to the first night with his bride was the zamindars or the jotdars. And that was a demand. You have to stop this sexual exploitation. Domestic battery. There's stories of women standing up in shomitis, and the movement was catalyzed by the Communist Party in those days, which had been brilliant in terms of mobilizing women as independent workers, not just Sahadharminis as in the Gandhian movement. Women getting up in the shomiti and actually taking full advantage of the egalitarian philosophy of the Communist Party and saying, "What gives my comrade the right to lift a hand at me?" Her husband's in the auditorium, in the audience. He's a comrade. What gives him a right to lift a hand at me? If we're talking about equality, let's get that straight. And domestic battery was banned. So these are things that came from the soil, from within us, and we lost touch with it. Hence we call this, hence I call it an unclaimed harvest in many ways. There were also several other very, very sophisticated transformations that took place in terms of, when I asked all the women, so what was your experience like during the Tebhaga movement? 50,000 women participated in the movement, approximately, informal count, but it was huge. They said, of course, the party was patriarchal. So give me examples. No, but I never faced discrimination. You begin to realize that the involvement was like a nasha. It was a sense of collective involvement that actually prevented them from critiquing the functionings of the collective from the individual point of view, because that would be selfish, that would be self-propagating. So it was an inability to critique from the Western feminist point of view. But look at the transformations they wrought. The ways in which they took over the villages, the ways in which they even, I'll give you one little sentence and that'll put things in place. There in England, a queen can rule the whole world, Victoria. And here, we can't lead a village. Using an anti-imperialist ideology, getting onto the footboard of an anti-imperialist ideology, they would create the space and support for themselves, for their men to support them. Because they are saying that if a queen there can do that, something like this, why can't we do it? So there were these sophisticated negotiations, but there were also ways in which the culture of entire village communities was transformed. When women actually managed to get themselves free of the zamindar's exploitation, it changes the very nature of conjugality. It brings back a sense of intimacy, a sense of privacy into the conjugal relationship. Both men and women get back their sense of pride, get back a sense of dignity. And that is something that actually seals them and bonds them in ways, in certain kinds of equal bonding, that is different from a challenge to patriarchy. It's a quiet transformation that men begin to value in certain ways, and men begin to respect and accept women with them. So there are certain kinds of transformations that are forged that are not in direct challenge to patriarchy in their communities. Of course, it is the patriarchy of the zamindari system that's being challenged. But it is also something that carries your men with you in different quiet ways without necessarily having to challenge them. So when they say that we were not, of course there was patriarchy, but we were not discriminated against, they're still transforming relationships, transforming balances of power within the community without necessarily frontally confronting the patriarchy within their families and communities. So there's a lot of wonderful sensitive transformations that are taking place. So from the political to the personal level, It's an amazing wealth of experiences that these women have shared with us. And that's been one of my biggest gains from the women's movement in terms of understanding this, and a great sense of pride that it took place here in Bengal.
Well, Asha, you, I think, were able to hear what Urvashi, the points that Urvashi and Kavita have been making. Your own work area has been in a very interesting area also of the Bhojpuri women and the Bhojpuri. And you had talked to me briefly about how language has also played a big role. What would you like to share with us today?
Thank you. तो आपने जैसा कि बता दिया है कि मेरे काम के केंद्र में बिहारी महिला है, खास तौर से भोजपुरी भाषी पिछड़ी और बहुजन जातियों की महिलाएं मेरे काम के केंद्र में हैं। हालांकि आप तीनों काफी दशकों से काम कर रहे हो और मेरे काम की अभी शुरुआत ही हुई है, तो मुझे एक घबराहट सी भी है। खैर, मैं अपनी बात इस तरह से रखने की कोशिश कर रही हूँ कि बिहारी महिला कहते ही एक लार्जर पब्लिक स्फीयर में या हम सभी के दिमागों में दो तरह की तस्वीरें, दो तरह के इमेज आते हैं। एक इमेज जो मीडिया में काफी पॉपुलर है और खास तौर से इलेक्शन या चुनाव के दौरान वो इमेज काफी सर्कुलेट होता है। लाइन में वोटर आईडी हाथ में लेकर खड़ी गरीब बिहारी महिलाएं, जिनको डेमोक्रेसी के उत्सव के रूप में प्रस्तुत किया जाता है। अक्सर फ्रंट पेज पे ये छपती हैं आम चुनावों के दौरान। तो ये जो इमेज है रूरल बिहारी महिलाओं का एक साथ समूह में वोट देने जाना, ये आजादी के बाद जो इलेक्टोरल डेमोक्रेसी आई है उसका एक डायरेक्ट कॉन्सिक्वेंस है। उनकी साक्षरता का जो भी स्तर हो, सामाजिक व्यवस्था में उनका जो भी स्थान हो, यूनिवर्सल फ्रेंचाइज की वजह से डेमोक्रेसी के इस उत्सव में उनकी भागीदारी एक हद तक, उनका पार्टिसिपेशन एक हद तक सुनिश्चित है। ये भागीदारी कितनी प्रभावशाली है, इम्पैक्टफुल है या फिर टोकन है, ये आगे की चर्चा का विषय हो सकता है। दूसरा इमेज जिसकी मैं बात करना चाहती हूँ, जो बिहारी या भोजपुरी भाषी महिलाओं को लेकर सर्कुलेट होता है और खास तौर से एकेडमिया और सिविल सोसाइटी ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस की विषय वस्तु है, वो है लेबरिंग बिहारी महिला, जो मतलब समूह में, झुंड में श्रम कर रही हैं, किसी खेत में, किसी फील्ड में श्रम कर रही हैं, अथवा समूह में लोकगीत, फोक सॉन्ग गा रही हैं। ऐसी बिहारी महिला की जो तस्वीर है आप पाएंगे कि अक्सर तमाम रूरल बिहार या उत्तर प्रदेश के बारे में जब भी चर्चा होती है तो ये किताबों की कवर बनता है। तो ये एक दूसरा इमेज है, झुंड में गीत गाती हुई महिलाएं या झुंड में श्रम करती हुई महिलाएं। तो आप देखेंगे कि एक व्यक्तिगत कोई पहचान नहीं है, बिहारी महिलाओं की पहचान एक झुंड के रूप में है। तो खैर इसी को लगातार इसी इमेज के साथ मैं जूझती रही हूँ, इंगेज होती रही हूँ। और खास तौर से लोकगीत गाने वाली ग्रामीण बिहारी महिलाएं जो भोजपुरी भाषी महिलाएं हैं, वेस्टर्न बिहार और ईस्टर्न उत्तर प्रदेश, उनके साथ मेरा एंगेजमेंट रहा है। तो आप देखेंगे कि ये जो इमेज है, ये इमेज तैयार होने की शुरुआत कैसे होती है। ये जो फोकलोरिस्टिक्स नाम का डिसिप्लिन है, जो लेट 19th सेंचुरी अर्ली 20th सेंचुरी में काफी प्रचलित हुआ। हालांकि उस समय काफी सारे नए विषय उग रहे थे, तो ये भी एक विषय था। इसको लेकर मतलब हिंदी में कोई सटीक शब्द नहीं है, लोक साहित्य का अध्ययन काफी बड़े स्तर पे होने की शुरुआत होती है 19वीं शताब्दी के उत्तरार्ध में। और ये वही समय है जब आप पाएंगे कि आधुनिक भाषाएं, मॉडर्न लैंग्वेजेस का स्टैंडर्डाइजेशन भी हो रहा था, मॉडर्न लैंग्वेजेस को एक रूप दिया जा रहा था। तो उसी समय भोजपुरी भाषी महिलाओं के लोकगीतों के अध्ययन की भी शुरुआत होती है और दूसरी तरफ दूसरी भाषाएं जो आधुनिक बनेंगी उनके मानकीकरण की भी शुरुआत होती है। अन्य प्रदेशों की बात तो मैं यहाँ नहीं कह पाऊंगी, लेकिन बिहार, उत्तर प्रदेश के लिए, बिहार के लिए खास तौर से हिंदी वो आधुनिक भाषा बन रही थी। हिंदी का निर्माण इस दौरान हो रहा था और बिहार को हिंदी प्रदेश बनाने की कवायद चल रही थी। और खास तौर पे तब जब 20वीं सदी 20th सेंचुरी के सेकेंड डेकेड में बिहार बंगाल प्रेसिडेंसी से अलग होकर एक नया प्रदेश बन रहा था, तो हिंदी को बिहार की आधिकारिक भाषा के रूप में लागू किया गया और धीरे धीरे उसका प्रसार शुरू किया गया। उस दौरान जो अभिजात्य सवर्ण बिहारी थे, जिनका हिंदी नामक भाषाई संसाधन पे पूरी तरह से कब्जा था, हिंदी उस समय का लिंग्विस्टिक रिसोर्स बनी जिसके ऊपर एक खास वर्ग का कब्जा हुआ और उनके सामने लेकिन जो बिहार की दूसरी नॉन स्टैंडर्ड भाषाएं थी, जैसे भोजपुरी, दूसरी भी भाषाएं हैं बिहार में, वो उनके सामने एक प्रकार से चुनौती की तरह थी कि उनका क्या किया जाए, क्योंकि बिहारी मास, बिहारी जन समुदाय नॉन स्टैंडर्ड भाषाओं में, बोलियों में ही अपनी पूरी जिंदगी जी रहा था। अभिजात्य वर्ग की पढ़ाई उर्दू, फारसी, अंग्रेजी और फिर अब 20वीं सदी की शुरुआत में हिंदी में होने लग गई थी, लेकिन मास एजुकेशन की शुरुआत अभी नहीं हुई थी। हालांकि उसकी अवधारणा चार्ल्स वुड डिस्पैच के जरिए प्रस्तुत कर दी गई थी, लेकिन मुझे लगता है कि मास एजुकेशन लागू होने की शुरुआत 1990 से पहले नहीं हुई है। मंडल कमीशन के आगमन के बाद ही इसकी शुरुआत होती है। आप पाएंगे कि आज भी फर्स्ट जनरेशन लर्नर्स हैं और विमेन लर्नर्स हैं, तो आजादी के 75 साल बाद भी। तो इसका मतलब यही है कि मास एजुकेशन की शुरुआत बहुत बाद में होती है। तो लेकिन खैर, हम 20वीं शताब्दी की बात कर रहे हैं, 20वीं शताब्दी के शुरुआती दौर की बात कर रहे हैं। उस समय जो अभिजात्य वर्ग था, जो एजुकेटेड था, एजुकेट हो रहा था और हिंदी के संसाधन का भी अब उपयोग करने लगा था, उनके सामने ये चुनौती थी कि बोलियों का क्या किया जाए जिसमें बड़ा जन समुदाय अपना जीवन बसर कर रहा है। तो हिंदी और संस्कृत पंडितों ने इन बोलियों के लिए जगह जगह निश्चित करने की शुरुआत की और इन बोलियों में घट रहे जीवन को लोक, जिसका इंग्लिश इक्विवेलेंट फोक है, उसकी संज्ञा दी और एक फोकलोरिस्टिक्स के बाउंड्री में उसको सजाने की कोशिश की। तो कुल मिला के कहने का मतलब ये है कि भोजपुरी जैसे बड़े जन समुदाय की भाषा अभिजात्य वर्ग की भाषा हिंदी का लोक बन गया, भोजपुरी का फोकलोराइजेशन हो गया। तो ये इस फोकलोराइजेशन से जन समुदाय पर क्या असर पड़ता है, जिसके पास खुद को अभिव्यक्त करने के लिए, खुद को एक्सप्रेस करने के लिए केवल यही संसाधन है, केवल यही भाषा है, दूसरी भाषाएं जिसके पास नहीं है। ये जन समुदाय आधुनिक स्पेसेस में कैसे एंटर करेगा? बेसिकली आधुनिक स्पेसेस में ये बड़ा जन समुदाय मूक हो जाता है, गूंगा हो जाता है, और इससे सबसे ज्यादा नुकसान होता है भोजपुरी भाषी महिलाओं का, खासतौर से भोजपुरी भाषी पिछड़ी, दलित, बहुजन महिलाओं का, क्योंकि उनकी भाषा के फोकलोराइजेशन की वजह से वो भाषाई अनागरिक हो गई, यानी कि लिंग्विस्टिक नॉन सिटीजन हो गई, और लोकतंत्र में उनकी अर्थपूर्ण भागीदारी सुनिश्चित नहीं हो सकी, एक मीनिंगफुल पार्टिसिपेशन सुनिश्चित नहीं हो सका। हालांकि मैं ये नहीं कह रही हूँ कि मैं लोक साहित्य के खिलाफ हूँ, मैं लोक साहित्य के पक्ष में हूँ, मैं उसके फेवर में हूँ और उसका खंडन भी नहीं कर रही हूँ, लेकिन मैं ये अंडरलाइन करना चाहती हूँ, ये रेखांकित करना चाहती हूँ कि अगर किसी भाषा समुदाय, किसी स्पीच कम्युनिटी की महिलाओं का सारा संसार, पूरा संसार लोक साहित्य में, मौखिक में सिमट के रह जाता है और वाइडर पब्लिक स्फीयर में उनकी भागीदारी नहीं है, तो उनके सिटीजनशिप का, उनकी नागरिकता का समुचित रियलाइजेशन, फुल रियलाइजेशन संभव नहीं हो पाता है। तो कुल मिला के फिलहाल यहाँ तक अपनी बात रखती हूँ, आगे फिर बात करेंगे जैसे जैसे आपके सवाल आएंगे।
Thank you. So she was looking at specifically at what has happened through the folklorization, as she said, of the Bhojpuri language, which has been turned into a sort of folk dialect of Hindi, and what the impact of that has been on women in particular, of course, to the larger population that speaks that language, but perhaps women, because their entire lives are lived in those languages and they don't get to move out maybe into other languages as much as others do. So we've had three very interesting areas of discussion put forward. Urvashi, let me get back to you by asking you that if you can think of a moment recently that has filled you with a lot of hope and joy regarding the kind of struggles and achievements that you feel women have been doing for years, what would you like to look at? And maybe Kavi, you could also start thinking. Here, you want my mic?
So the other thing that I wanted to talk about actually could also be an answer to Anjum's question, is one of the things that's filled me with hope. And that's the joy of the women's movement, that you have a lot of disappointments, but you also have some amazing moments of solidarity. And this was a conference that had been organized in Lahore on the 30th anniversary of the genocide in Bangladesh. And Urvashi was one of the organizers also. I think it was organized by Nigat at the Astra Lahore Women's Studies Center. But Urvashi was there, Uma was there, many of us were there. So I remember on the anniversary itself, Nigat Said Khan, who was the Pakistani woman who had organized this, stood up to introduce the day and how they felt about it, how the Pakistani women felt about it. And she said that, you know, many of them who are now in their late 60s, early 70s, were in university at that point in time. And when they heard about what the Pakistani army had been doing to the women of Bangladesh, it was rage, shame, fury, and they raised a demand together, demanding that the Pakistani army apologize to the women of Bangladesh. And, you know, this was a gathering of Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi women. And I remember Nigat standing there and saying that the only time I feel ashamed to call myself a Pakistani is when I think of what the Pakistani men did to the women of Bangladesh. Now imagine any of us standing in front of Pakistanis and saying, the one time I feel ashamed to be an Indian is when I think this. So it was a very big thing. But it was also testimony to the way a certain commitment to women's lives, to women's solidarity, to women's dignity was even more important than state loyalty. That was these basic things that were in place. So she talked about how there were three kinds of silences at that point in time. One was the silence of people who knew what was happening but said nothing. The other was the complete blackout in the media. Nobody would talk about what was happening. And the third was people who knew what was happening, were completely distraught about it, signed signature campaigns. These are the progressives. And Faiz Ahmed Faiz, the major Urdu poet amongst them, was one person who went out to Bangladesh in complete supplication. And he came back and wrote his famous poem, Dhaka Se Vapsi Par, which is basically a trope. It's a love poem. Hum ke thehre ajnabi itni madar raaton ke baad. And it's lover and beloved, but he's talking about the people of Bangladesh, East Pakistan and West Pakistan, erstwhile people of Bangladesh and this thing. How did we get separated? And can we not communicate to each other? It's a people separated. And what happened was that the divides that took place, and the two lines that go, "Ankahi reh gayi wo baat unse jo kehne gaye the Faiz." This was the third kind of silence, where you were speechless at the horrors of the war. Now, what had happened was that the reason why we could have this conference at all with the Indian, Pakistani, and Bangladeshi women together in the year 2001 was because obviously the Pakistani army did not apologize to the women of Bangladesh. But the women of Pakistan reached out to the women of Bangladesh via their Indian feminist friends. And this is where I say, you know, people like Urvashi, Uma, they all played a very important role in terms of connecting the women of Pakistan to the feminists of Bangladesh, building those bridges across nations to actually bring women together in dignity, in power, in celebration. And that's why we had Bangladeshi women there as much as we had Pakistani and Indian women there together. And then after having talked about this, when Nigat played that song, she played Naira Noor's rendition of Hum Ke Thehre Ajnabi Itni Madar Raaton Ke Baad. All of us from all three nations stood up instinctively, holding hands, literally clutching onto each other's hands. And it was the closest we've ever come to an anthem for South Asia. And it took the women's movement to do that.
Thank you, Kavi, for reminding us of that very moving moment. It's really important. So, Anjum, in answer to your question, there are so many moments. It's difficult to pick out. I mean, every new book I publish brings me that realization that something wonderful is happening and women are actually recording and writing it. Every time I teach, I mentioned sticking the mic into my churidar, but actually there are 100 students in that class, half of them are men. And it would never have happened 20 years ago that there would be young men, curious, interested, sitting in a course on feminism and the women's movement. But I'll tell you one story that came to my mind immediately. It goes back to 1988 when we had a big conference of women's movements in Patna. This was one of the conferences we have every 4 years, which for 4 or 5 years, which is totally self-organized, non-funded, etc., etc. There was a woman there who was a Muslim woman from Tamil Nadu called Sharifa Khanum, who was living and working in Delhi. And she got an opportunity in the Patna conference to go and act as a translator for Tamil women who were coming in. And many of the discussions might have been in Hindi. And because she was from Delhi, I mean, she had been living in Delhi, she understood Hindi. So she started sitting in these informal gatherings of 200 women talking about violence against women. In one corner, the women from Tamil Nadu, for whom she was doing the translation. And she started to listen to the stories of violence. And she thought, my God, these are things we are talking about in public. These are not things that we have to keep secret as we've been told to keep them. And she started to think about that and to discover the solidarity that comes from talking and listening in a safe space. And she went back to Tamil Nadu and she decided that she wanted to set up something to help women. So she did, negotiating from within religion. So using the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, she reread the Quran and she asked this question that there is a village Jamaat or a community Jamaat in Muslim societies in our country, where people go for daily issues when you don't want to go to the courts, etc. And she asked, is there anything in the Quran that says there can't be a women's Jamaat? Why must it always be men? Because she was finding that a lot of women didn't bring their issues to the men because often it was your father-in-law sitting on the Jamaat. How could you complain about your husband beating you up? So she started to create a women's Jamaat. 12 women came together to do this. Today, there are 30,000 women. And these women have become a force to reckon with in Tamil Nadu. They address issues. They have so much power. Even the men come to them now with issues. And their next step now is to set up a women's mosque. I mean, if you can do that with one woman starting, imagine if women were given the opportunity, what could be possible?
Wow. That's two wonderfully inspiring real life situations and stories that we've heard. I'd like to ask Asha if she would like to add something to this. If we ask you the same question, can you pick out anything in particular that strikes you as being particularly inspiring?
मुझे ऐसा लगता है आप लोगों के पास बहुत सारे अनुभव हैं और काफी सारा वक्त आपने मूवमेंट में गुजारा है. मुझे लगता है कि मेरे लिए ये सबसे सुखद या सबसे बेहतरीन साल जो रहा है या दशक रहा है, जिस दशक में मैंने अपनी हायर एजुकेशन कंप्लीट की है 2002 से लेकर 2011, 12, 13 तक, मतलब अपना BA, MA, PhD के दौरान और जो मेरा एंगेजमेंट मेरे वयस्क जीवन में रहा है, उस दौरान मैंने देखा है कि बहुत सारी महिलाएं हॉस्टलों में आकर रह रही हैं जो SC, ST, OBC जाति की महिलाएं हैं और पहली बार अलग अलग भाषा के SC, ST, OBC जाति की महिलाएं एक दूसरे से बात कर रही हैं. उनका एक कलेक्टिव, एक नेशनल स्केल पे हायर एजुकेशन के संस्थानों में बनता है. हालांकि ये बहुत दुखद है कि अब उस तरह के हायर एजुकेशन के संस्थान जहाँ पे बहुत कम खर्चे में पढ़ाई हो जाए, जहाँ पे फर्स्ट जनरेशनर महिलाएं इकट्ठा हो, प्रथम पीढ़ी की महिलाएं इकट्ठा हो, वो तेजी से समाप्त हो रहे हैं. लेकिन पिछले 1-1.5 दशकों में हमने देखा है कि महिलाओं की आमद, फर्स्ट जनरेशनर महिलाओं की आमद बढ़ी है हायर एजुकेशन में, और हायर एजुकेशन कैंपसेस में और हॉस्टलों में उनके बीच में इंटरैक्शन बढ़ा है. भले ही उनके इंटरैक्शन के जो भी कारण रहे हो, पोस्ट मैट्रिक फेलोशिप रही हो, लेकिन मुझे ये लगता है कि ये एक पहली बार ऐसा हुआ है बिकॉज ऑफ अफर्मेटिव एक्शन कि विमेन ऑफ डिफरेंट कास्ट्स could come together and could speak to each other in the context of higher education. So I won't be able to give you, particular stories, but this is something which I have been feeling that is very important, and we need to, make public education more accessible so that such instances increases or इनका mobilization और हो पाए.
Thank you, Asha. That's a very, very interesting point. Thank you. We have one question from the audience. Anunna, was it you who wanted to ask something?
So I was really struck by the point that you make, and very well argued too, about how this whole business of folklorizing Bhojpuri ends up at some level disenfranchising women for whom that's the vernacular. I was just wondering if you'd see the Mauritian context as something different. If, what's happening? I was remembering how Bhojpuri songs in particular and language and the literature available orally to indentured women laborer who had been forced to migrate there had become a very interesting rallying point and something that they used to keep the community together. So do you think that the problem of essentialization also applies to that community, or is the story different? Are they more enfranchised by Bhojpuri there than here in Bihar?
Okay, very very interesting question and thank you for asking me. एक्चुअली मॉरिशस के लिए कहानी बिल्कुल अलग है, क्योंकि मॉरिशस में आप पाएंगे कि वहां के लिए भोजपुरी भाषा उनके लिए हेरिटेज है। वहां वो एक बहुत ही अलग नए कॉन्टेक्स्ट में जाते हैं, जहां उनको कास्ट हायरार्की से बचने का भी मौका मिलता है, उनको नई भाषाएं और नए रिसोर्सेस। एक जनरेशन मजदूरी किया, दो जनरेशन, 2 पीढ़ियों ने मजदूरी की, लेकिन तीसरी चौथी पीढ़ी से आप पाएंगे कि उनको नए रिसोर्स हासिल होते हैं और उनको जो होमलैंड का कास्ट स्ट्रक्चर है वो एस्केप करने को मिलता है। तो दूसरी भाषाएं जैसे फ्रेंच हुआ, इंग्लिश हुआ, उन भाषाओं का भी ज्ञान उनको मिलता है और उस भाषा में वो सक्षम बनते हैं। तो भोजपुरी उनके लिए एक हेरिटेज का मामला है और भोजपुरी में वो सारा जीवन अपना वहां जी नहीं रहे हैं, तो इसीलिए वो भोजपुरी को बहुत ही खूबसूरती से याद करते हैं। इनफैक्ट आप पाएंगे पेगी मोहन जिन्होंने किताब लिखी है जहाजिन, जो ट्रिनिडाड की लिंग्विस्ट, मतलब ट्रिनिडाड भोजपुरी पे जिन्होंने काम किया है, लिंग्विस्ट हैं, भाषाविद हैं, उन्होंने यही लिखा है कि उनके आज वो 70 साल की होंगी लगभग, तो आज के जो जनरेशन के पेरेंट्स हैं वो बिल्कुल घबराते नहीं है भोजपुरी से, क्योंकि भोजपुरी उनके लिए बहुत ही एक खूबसूरत मेमोरी है। उसमें वो अपनी पूरी जिंदगी नहीं जी रहे हैं, वो उनकी जिंदगी का एक छोटा सा हिस्सा है। जो मजदूर काम करने गए थे और उनके जो बच्चे थे उनको उन्होंने बहुत ही फोर्सफुली रोका था भोजपुरी में व्यवहार करने से, और उनको कोशिश की थी कि अंग्रेजी और फ्रेंच सिखाई जाए। तो वो पीढ़ी की जो असुरक्षा की भावना है जब मिट जाती है तो भोजपुरी उनके लिए खूबसूरत हो जाती है। पर उत्तर प्रदेश और बिहार में वो असुरक्षा की भावना, वो असुरक्षा आज तक मिटी नहीं है, वो इनसिक्योरिटी बनी हुई है और पूरी जिंदगी लोग एक भाषा में बिता रहे हैं जो भाषा आधुनिक जगहों पर इंपॉर्टेंस नहीं रखती है। इसीलिए बिहार की कहानी बहुत अलग है और मॉरिशस की कहानी अलग है। मॉरिशस के भोजपुरी लोग अपनी भोजपुरी को एक रोमांटिक दृष्टिकोण से देख पाने में आज सिक्योर हैं, सक्षम हैं। थैंक यू।
Thank you for the question, opening it out actually across borders, which Kavi had already done with talking of cross-border solidarities. Thank you very much, Asha. Thank you. And it's good to see you on the screen. And I'd like to thank Urvashi and Kavita for taking part in this session. Thank you.